So today I'm going to focus on an automotive icon, one of my heroes, Lee Iacocca. Lee Iacocca was born, well, I'm going to switch screens here. Here we go. Lee Iacocca was born in 1924 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. His parents were immigrants, of course, from Italy. His given name wasn't Lee, it was Lito. But Lee kind of stuck and was more American than Lito. So Lee stuck, he became known as Lee Iacocca. A little side note, his family back then, back in the 20s and 30s, started a business in Allentown, Pennsylvania, called Yoko's Hot Dogs. And Yoko's Hot Dogs is still in business in Allentown today. Members of his family still own it and run it. There are 3 locations in Allentown. Yoko's Hot Dogs, you can look that up. That's Lee Iacocca's family from his hometown in Allentown. He was educated in Allentown schools, and once he graduated from high school, he went to Lehigh University, where he got a 4-year degree in mechanical engineering. He went from there to Princeton and got his master's in mechanical engineering. In 1946, he was hired by Ford Motor Company in their engineering department. After a short stint in their engineering department, he realized he didn't like it. He didn't like engineering. He wanted to be a salesman. He wanted to be part of sales and promotion. So he asked the higher-ups at Ford if he could get into the sales end of the business, and they gave him a shot at the Philadelphia zone. In the early 1950s, he became the zone manager for sales for Ford in the Philadelphia district. And in 1956, he came up with an ingenious idea to help sell cars. It was a promotion that he called 56 in 56, meaning $56 down, $56 a month for 3 years, you could drive a brand new Ford. Nowadays, that's commonplace. We hear that stuff all the time. But he was one of the first ones to do it. That had never been done before, those types of promotions. They're all over the TV and the radio now, but in 1956, they didn't do that sort of thing. Lee Iacocca had the idea to do it for the Philadelphia zone dealers, and it took off like hotcakes. They couldn't keep 56 Fords in stock. Dearborn took note. They saw what was happening. His 56 and 56 promotion went nationwide, and it was a big hit. He soon ended up in Dearborn, and he became vice president of sales in Dearborn, and he was named vice president in 1960. Didn't take him long to go up through the ladder, but he knew he was a smart man. There's his baby picture. So that's probably what you think of most when you think of Lee Iacocca, the Mustang, right? And he is the father of the Mustang. I will give a little bit of kudos, though, to the Corvair, being a big fan of the Corvair. In 1962, Chevrolet introduced a turbocharged version of the Corvair called the Corvair Spider. And it was a pretty innovative car. It was a turbocharged rear-engine vehicle, and it could produce 150 horsepower. That car had bucket seats. It was a 2-door, either a coupe or a convertible. It had bucket seats, could fit 4 people, had a 4-speed floor shift on the floor. Most cars of that day, we had the shifter, manual shifter up here, right? It was a 4 on the floor, 4-passenger little sports car that was affordable. And Chevrolet couldn't keep them in stock. They went nuts. The press loved them, the owners loved them. They really found a niche. Mr. Iacocca was now the VP over at Ford in the early 60s, and saw what Chevrolet had done to the Corvair, 4-speed, bucket seats, 4-passenger, affordable coupe and convertible. The idea of the Mustang was born. The Mustang, the early Mustangs are really just a re-engineered, with not a whole lot of thought involved, Ford Falcon. If you take an early Mustang, like a 65 Mustang, and put it on a lift and put a 65 Ford Falcon on a lift next to it, you stand under them, you can't tell them apart. They're really a re-engineered Falcon. ingenious. They introduced the car at the New York World's Fair at the Ford display in 1963, 1964, spring of 64, I believe. That's when they introduced the car. And it was an immediate success. So we know the rest is history as far as that. It's one of the longest running nameplates in automotive history.
What was the price tag back then?
The base, so you could customize a Mustang. You could get it, it could be an economical grocery getter with a little 6-cylinder engine and a 3-speed stick. And I think the base price of that was probably around $2,300.
Yeah, I bought it in 1965 when I graduated. That was the first car I bought. It was a Mustang. $2,000.
$2,000, yeah. Little 6-cylinder one?
Sorry?
Did it have a 6-cylinder or was it a V8?
No, it was a 6-cylinder.
6-cylinder, yeah. You could customize them. That was the great thing about them too, is you could customize the car however you want. You could make it an economical grocery getter with a little 6-cylinder engine and bare bones, or you could build it right up to be sort of luxurious. They had what they called a pony interior, which was a luxury package interior with really pretty two-tone seats. You could get air conditioning and a tachometer and power steering and power brakes. You could really gussy it up, or you could make it a sports car and put a V8 in it with the 4-speed manual and dual exhaust. They had a GT model that came out in '65. So you could really customize the Mustang. That's where the Corvair lacked. And eventually the Corvair Spider Turbo couldn't keep up with its competition in the Mustang, and Chevrolet designed the Camaro instead. Thank you. Chevrolet designed the Camaro instead to compete with the Mustang. It was more traditional. So there's a couple of cars built in the 1970s. It's not a Gremlin, but there's a couple of cars that were built in the 1970s that he was the driving force behind too, that are a little bit notorious, but in different ways. And the car here in front of us is one of those vehicles, the Pinto, the Ford Pinto. Lee had the idea as far back as 1968 for a small, economical commuter vehicle. The Japanese vehicles were gaining in popularity here even in the 1960s, and the American car companies still weren't getting it, although they had done a pretty good job with the Corvair and the Falcon and the Valiant, Dart, things like that. It still wasn't hitting it out of the park, and there were small Japanese cars from Datsun and Honda, Toyota, that were still selling like crazy. The Volkswagen Beetle, right? And the Falcon and the Valiant and the Corvair were still too big in terms of that. So in 1968, the idea came to Ford, Lee Iacocca specifically, that they wanted a small economic car to compete head on with the Japanese imports. And they started designing the Pinto in 1968. Lee's idea was to have a car that was under 2,000 pounds and under $2,000. And the Pinto was introduced in 1971. I have 3 million Pintos were sold from 1971 to 1980 when it went out of production. The Pinto became kind of notorious for one thing in particular. Exploding gas tanks. Did anyone here ever own a Pinto? We've got 2. Anybody at home? We have got 2 people in the audience that have owned Pintos, Ford Pintos. I figured we'd have someone, at least one, or know someone, or had a relative or a friend. I mean, I certainly did. Lee called it the right car for the right time later in his book. He wrote a couple books later in life, and he called the Pinto the right car at the right time. But the problem was it wasn't the right car in a lot of rear-end collisions. The coupe in particular, the station wagon, I don't think suffered from this problem because they did have a little wagon version too. The coupe had a filler neck tube, the filler neck that you put the gas in that brings the gas down to the tank. A filler neck tube that would detach itself from the tank in a rear-end collision.
Oh, that's why.
And that's why That's why. And they really came out of under fire, no pun intended, in that around 1977 for that issue. They really started to get a lot of flack around 1977. Surprisingly, not earlier, because the car had already been out for 6 years. 1977 is when Ford really started to get a lot of flack, and the Highway Traffic Safety Institute got involved, and they had to recall every Pinto that would have ever been sold. They recalled them, brought them back, and had the filler neck gas tank reinforced. So they ultimately had to admit defeat, although I'm sure they defended it till the end to have to avoid those costs. It's been said that Ford, when they designed the car, had 2 roads to take with the design of that gas tank. This road was going to be a little bit more expensive than this road, so they took this road. And ultimately, they paid the price. So today, I wouldn't say Pintos are collectible, but they're certainly iconic. And if one came into my shop in Abington, I certainly wouldn't turn it away. I did recently just sell a Chevy Vega, which was a similar vehicle, sort of the Chevy version of the Pinto. Didn't suffer from rear-end collision fires, but suffered from many other issues, like rusting the day they left the showroom, the Vega. And it was said that when you went to the gas station with your Chevy Vega, you told the attendant to check your gas and fill your oil. The engines were aluminum. Quick story about the Vega. It's got nothing to do with Lee Iacocca, so I'm not going to spend much time on it. But another icon was the driving force behind the Vega, and that was John Delorean. John Delorean was the president of Chevrolet when the Vega was designed and introduced, and it was sort of his baby. Great in theory. It wasn't a bad-looking car when it came out. It looked like a little Camaro. They built a manufacturing plant solely for the Vega in Lordstown, Ohio, and they even created a real interesting way to ship the cars to the dealers. And whereas they would ship these cars in rail cars upright, they could fit more of them in a rail. The cars were literally shipped nose to back upright. There's a picture of it online. I would bring it, but it has nothing to do with Iacocca, so I would. The cars were shipped nose down, upright, roof to roof to roof to roof, all the way down the rail car. It was allowed them to fit more cars in a rail car. And the engines were actually designed for that. They put baffles in the engine to keep the oil from all going down to one spot. That way it kept the engine lubricated throughout, even though it was sideways. I think that was just the beginning of its problems. So, my grandmother owned 2 Vegas, so I guess she was a glutton for punishment. So we had some pretty crappy cars in the 70s, you know, the Pinto, the Vega, and then one of the other cars that I'll mention from Lee Iacocca's next endeavor. So another vehicle that Lee was involved with, and a lot of people laughed at them and still do today, but Ford laughed all the way to the bank with these cars, is the Mustang Two. By 1973, the original Mustang, which you see in the background there, had lost its original flair. It got fatter, it got wider. 1969 saw a much bigger Mustang, and by 1973 it was big, almost like a Gran Torino big. Big long hood, short deck, and it lost its appeal with a lot of people. They had the foresight to want to downsize the car as Americans were becoming more fuel conscious, and of course we were heading into an oil embargo too. Little did they know when they were designing it, so it turned out to be a good thing. The Mustang Two, you can see has a lot of the styling cues from the original Mustang. And in 1974, they introduced it to replace the big, fat, outgoing 1973. The 1974 versus the 1973 Mustang was 490 pounds lighter and 19 inches shorter than its predecessor. And they used, like I said before, they used a lot of the styling cues in the 74 that they had in the original. You see that sculpting on the side. The headlights and grille had a sort of 65, 66-esque look, and even the dashboard with the gauges. They sold the Mustang Two from 1974 to 1978. It shares a lot with the Pinto. A lot of people call it the Pinto Mustang. His idea was to have top-notch quality control in the car. He called it his little princess when it was introduced in 1974, for 1974 model year. Today, as far as Mustang collectors go, it's the least sought after generation of the Mustang because it's Pinto-esque, you know. But they have their place in history. And just like the Pinto, he mentioned it as well on the Mustang Two in a later book, it was the right car at the right time. It was introduced in the middle of an oil embargo, so they sold them like hotcakes. Ford sold a lot of them. Was the quality control as high as he wanted it to be? Was it his little princess? Probably not. But many cars of the 70s, and we already talked about some of them, just the American car quality control just wasn't there. And that's when the Japanese really started to take over. So, in 1978, Ford had one of its biggest years in profits. And Lee was still, by then Lee was the president. Lee went from vice president to president of Ford in 1970. Forgot to mention that. The problem was he worked under Henry Ford II during this time frame, and they didn't get along. They just did not get along. They were oil and water. In 1978, Ford had one of its biggest years in profit, and he was the president. Yet Henry Ford II fired him. They just did not get along. So we know now who picked him up right away. The Chrysler Corporation. That was the Chrysler Corporation, which was on life support at the time. Their vehicle, that many reasons why Chrysler was on life support in the late 1970s, but one of the big reasons Chrysler was on life support is their vehicle of the 1970s that was supposed to change the world and make them all kinds of money and make them a leader, which didn't happen. The Plymouth Volare and Dodge Aspen. Anyone familiar with those vehicles? There was a lot of them around in the 70s. They had that familiar slant six engine, most of them. Yeah. Great engines. Everything around it, though, in that car was bad. And that was a highly, I think one of the most, if not the most recalled car in history. And it was killing, the expenses were killing Chrysler in the late 70s. And their reputation had gone really, really downhill mainly because of those two cars. So they were able to convince Lee to come over to their side of the table from Ford. Of course, he was recently out of work anyway. And he realized right out of the gate that they were going to need a lot of money to fix the problems. It wasn't something that could be fixed with just procedures. It was too late for that. They needed a lot of money. So here he is going before Congress in 1979 and asking for that famous loan, something that had never been done before, right? Asking for a bailout. Been done several times since, but in 1979 it had never been done before. And of course, he received the loan and paid it back 7 years early. 7 years early. This car here in this picture that he's sitting on the hood of is one of the reasons he was able to pay that loan back 7 years early. The K car. The K car. How about a K car? There must be someone here that owned a K car. You again.
Early, the first year of, it was based on the K car of the Caravan.
Okay, in 84. Yeah, we'll show a picture of that too. Yeah. You own 6 of them. The last presentation I did, a gentleman said he had owned 4 of them. And in most of my career in the car industry, in the car dealerships, I worked at Chrysler, Plymouth, Dodge, and Jeep dealerships, that umbrella. And I worked from 1987 up until last year. So in 1987 even, we still couldn't keep minivans in stock. They were the #1 selling minivan for 25 years straight. I think Toyota finally beat them out recently, I mean maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I think Chrysler kind of gave up on the minivan, although they still have that Pacifica crossover, which is kind of a minivan. But the Caravan and the Voyager are dead. But go back to what you were saying, at the dealerships that I worked at, it was not uncommon to see people come back, trade them in for a new model. They liked them that
And we
much.
own the Pacific now, so.
You have a Pacifica, so that's the close, I guess that's the new generation of minivan, right?
Van and drag,
Yeah, yeah.
Whatever.
So Chrysler introduced this K car in 1981, and again, sold like crazy. They made a ton of money, and the K car, along with the help of the minivan, which I think, yeah, the minivan is what saved Chrysler, and it was allowed them to pay back that loan 7 years early. And both those cars were Lee Iacocca's idea. The minivan in particular is a funny story. He had the idea in mind to build that minivan at Ford. He had this in his head and on paper with designers at Ford for years prior to introducing it at Chrysler. And Henry Ford II hated the idea, wouldn't allow him to build it. Probably because it was Lee Iacocca's idea and he just didn't like Lee Iacocca. It was called the Minimax project. And when he went to Chrysler, he took his designer that helped him design the Minimax at Ford with him to Chrysler. And they continued it and they introduced it at Chrysler, and now we know, as we just said. #1 selling minivan for 25 years in a row. That's an early minivan right there. That's probably at 84. 1984 is when they were introduced. K car came out in 81, and actually that car's underpinnings are K car as well. They built that off the K car platform.
And the first 5 years that they built it, they offered it with a 5-speed transmission.
Yes.
Believe it or not.
Yes.
Which is what my wife wanted. We were happy. Now they stopped doing that, you know.
The gentleman in the audience had one with how many did you have with 5-speed transmissions?
2.
2 with 5 speeds. Because the dealers,
It stopped in 88.
yes, I remember.
The 5-speed with a manual transmission.
89. You know why I know it was 89? Because in 89 you could get a turbocharged minivan. You could get a 2.5 turbo in your minivan. I worked at the dealership in Franklin, and we sold them new. And a gentleman came in and ordered a brand new 89 Voyager with a turbo and a 5-speed. I'd love to have that van today. It was a 5-speed turbo minivan. I'll never forget it. It was white with tan interior, and it had the turbo emblem on the front fender. They only made the turbos for 2 years because they couldn't keep up with the demand for the V6. Because the regular 4-cylinder was just too slow. You probably experienced that too.
It went from, I think, 105 to the turbo was 150 or something.
Yeah, yeah. It was a fun turbo. They put that engine in a lot of their cars. Yeah, Lebarons. And throughout the 1980s, just about everything, with the exception of their big rear-wheel drive cars like the Fifth Ave and the Diplomats, which didn't really sell well by then anyway. Every other car that they sold was based off that K car platform. So they got a lot of money and a lot of mileage out of that platform. Lee Iacocca's idea. But I found it interesting that the minivan started at Ford and it got killed right off the bat. Another thing that he did at Chrysler, and this is one of my favorites, I've owned several of these, is he revived the American convertible. They said the convertibles were dead. The last American convertible was the 1976 Cadillac Eldorado. We thought the Highway Traffic Administration was going to outlaw them because they were going to stiffen rollover collision mandates, and of course the convertible wouldn't do good in a rollover. Air conditioning was becoming more popular, becoming standard in cars that never had before. Sunroofs and T-tops had come into vogue. Convertibles were expensive, they were noisy, they could be drafty. So Americans, by the mid-1970s, I think convertibles accounted for maybe 3 or 4% of sales, as opposed to like 1965 when it was like in the high teens in sales. They had really fallen out of favor, plus the upcoming supposed law that never happened. The car companies just phased out their convertibles. And then Cadillac made a big deal in 1976 with the discontinuation of their Eldorado convertible. They advertised it as a future collectible. This is the last American convertible to be built, until Lee Iacocca came around. That law never came out. That rollover mandate never happened. So what Lee did was he took one of his favorite K cars, a Dodge Aries, I believe, and he had the styling department cut the roof off of it. And he drove it around Detroit. And these are the crowds that he would gain. driving his convertible around. And everybody came up to him and asked him how they could order one. He said, we need to bring it back. So the Lebaron Convertible, Lebaron was just a glorified K car, was introduced in 1982, and he revived the American convertible. All his idea. And soon after that, other American car companies followed suit with the Mustang. GM came out with the Buick Riviera, the Cavalier convertible, the Sunbird, and then of course GM brought back the Eldorado convertible too, which brought on another issue for them. There he is with his convertibles. He even had the wood grain reminiscent of the old Town and Countries from the 1940s. I actually had one of those a few years ago. They're a lot of fun to drive, and people just don't know what to say when they see it. They either love it or hate it. And if you're a Seinfeld fan, if you watch the show Seinfeld, the John Voight car in Seinfeld was a K car LeBaron with the wood grain. So when you drive one today, inevitably you just wait for the comment, was that John Voight's car? A lot of fun. But again, I mean, more mileage that he got out of that K car platform, the convertible through the K car.
I have a story to tell.
Okay.
A story to tell about the LeBaron. In the late 70s, I was the attorney for Chrysler Corporation in Chicago. And I had to go to Detroit fairly often, once a month. So when I went there, I heard stories about Iaccoca. And the stories that I liked the most were the LeBaron stories. When the LeBaron was being designed, the designers called Iaccoca in to look at it. And he walked around it, and he looked at it, and he looked at the designers and goes, where's the back seat? Because they had designed it as a two-seater sports car.
Yeah.
Without a back seat.
Yeah.
So the designers had to go back and incorporate a back seat into their design. Why the Baron had nothing more than a ledge for the back seat, which was the most uncomfortable place to sit. The only people that could sit there were children.
And even they'd be uncomfortable.
Yeah. And the second story relates to the advertising for the LeBaron. They wanted to sell it as a sort of high-end luxury type convertible. So they hired Ricardo Montalban to be the spokesman.
Yeah.
And so if you recall, he would come on the commercials and talk about the rich Corinthian leather. Turns out that was all made up.
It's all made up. Yep.
There's no such thing as rich Corinthian leather or any Corinthian leather. Completely a fiction. But it's part of our national conversation.
Yes, and it's, folklore. And everybody today even knows rich Corinthian leather. Even people that weren't around during that advertising knows what rich Corinthian leather is or supposed to be. And then you usually have to correct them that there is no such thing. But it sounds good. Back to your comment about the back seat. If you look at early production models of the LeBaron convertible in '82, in fact, there's a magazine article, like Motor Trend or one of those, where they test drove an early production LeBaron convertible and tested it for the magazine. It's a vehicle, it's one that has no back seat. It's all carpeted behind the front seat. They probably should have just left it because the roof was so big and cumbersome that when you folded it, and it was a small car to begin with, there was really not much room back there for a seat. But like he said, they did add a seat back there, or what they would call a seat, and it was probably about the size of this magazine, straight up in the back. And I can talk from experience because in 1986, I was a junior in high school, and I bought a 1982 Chrysler LeBaron convertible, and I thought I was the cat's meow, I loved it. And it had that tiny little back seat, and we walked to school where I lived, and we didn't have bus service, so you drove or you walked. So I had the car. A lot of my friends didn't have a car yet. I had this LeBaron with this tiny little back seat. You'd be amazed how many of us could fit into that back seat. Thanks for that. Thanks for that input. I appreciate that. You could probably run this better than I could. We won't talk about the TC by Maserati. TC by Maserati was another, I don't have a picture of it, and I'm sure the gentleman on the Zoom knows exactly where I'm going with this. It was another variation of the K car that Lee Iacocca dreamt up with his buddy Di Tommaso Maserati. He was friends with him, and it was a joint venture with Maserati and Chrysler, and they were going to build this roadster, this two-seater roadster to compete with the likes of Jaguar and Mercedes with their SL. And it had a removable hardtop with little porthole windows in the back like the old Thunderbirds. And it was a great idea on paper, but by the time the car actually finally came into production and the penny pinchers out at Chrysler got a hold of it, it was too much like a LeBaron. It looked just like a LeBaron, except it had really nice leather interior crafted in Italy. The car was actually built in Italy and brought over here for finish. But the end product looked just like a current generation LeBaron convertible. And it was $33,000 as opposed to $16,000 for a LeBaron. And it didn't have a back seat.
Turbocharged four-cylinder engine.
The first year, they made them from 89 to 91. They sold like 7,000 total. They were a complete failure because of what I just mentioned. It had LeBaron gauges and a K-car shifter. The first year they came out, they had a Chrysler 2.2 intercooled turbo, which was a fun little motor. It was like the same motor they would put in a Shelby Daytona of the day, but not very Maserati-ish, a little raspy, a little loud, you know. And then 90 and 91, the last 2 years they made them, they replaced the turbo with a V6, which was a little bit more sedate, a little bit more fitting probably to the car. But the funny thing is, it was an American car built in Italy with a Mitsubishi V6. Had the Mitsubishi 3-liter V6 in it, which your minivans probably has some. So here's going back to what I mentioned before. This is one of the advertisements for the last Cadillac convertible from Cadillac. Today a classic, tomorrow a collector's item, the last American convertible, I think it says over there. And this advertising got GM into a little bit of trouble when they reintroduced the Eldorado convertible in 1984. This is 1976. Big car, about 20 feet long. Boss Hogg drove one on the Dukes of Hazzard, with horns on the hood. Yeah. So with the reincarnation of the convertible, thanks to Lee Iacocca, the other car companies all jumped back into the ring with their convertibles, and Cadillac brought back the Eldorado convertible in 1984, and it brought on a class action lawsuit by 1976 owners who were told by Cadillac that was the last American convertible and it was going to be a future collector's item. I don't think they went anywhere with their suit, but they tried. Yeah. There's Lee paying back the loan early. Nice PR move there. He made the cover of Time a few times, and there he is with the LeBaron convertible with the woody trim. Detroit's comeback kid. I mean, it was quite a thing. I remember it vividly, as you probably all do too. And then since then, he retired in 1992 from Chrysler. He hated retirement. He missed working. Attempted to get back into Chrysler in the mid-90s, 1995. He, along with one of their major shareholders, tried to take back Chrysler because it was, I think Mercedes was getting involved then. I think he was trying to get it before that happened, Daimler. Daimler, I worked for the dealerships when Chrysler bought controlling shares, Daimler bought controlling shares of Chrysler, and it seemed to me like they had a profit. They were making a lot of money when Daimler bought Chrysler. It seemed to me like they took a lot of that money and spent it on their own products over in Germany, and the Chrysler quality and new vehicles started to go downhill. So I find that to be a low spot in Chrysler's history, the Daimler takeover. Then, of course, after that, we know what happened, bankruptcies and equity firms taking it over, and then Fiat, more recently purchased Chrysler, and now Fiat's out and Peugeot or something. I can't even keep track anymore. I can't even, and I saw a lot of ups and downs with product quality. You'd get excited because things would be getting better, and then all of a sudden there'd be a takeover or something, and the quality in the cars would go down and sales would go down. So I was with Chrysler through a lot of the ups and downs, but I'm proud to say that for a majority of my career, or a good part of it, the first 1/3 of it, I guess, he was in charge. So we always felt good about what was coming out. Even though the cars, even the K cars, I mean, they weren't the greatest things in the world, but they had a great warranty. If you remember, they were one of the first ones to do a 7-year, 70,000-mile powertrain warranty. Other car companies weren't doing anything like that. As far as his personal life, he was married 3 times. His first marriage lasted the longest. I'm just going to check the 1956 to 1983. He was married to Mary McCleary, who died at 57 years old from diabetes. So he became a champion in her honor for diabetes research. He made a promise to her before she died that he would make sure a cure was found. Of course, that hasn't happened yet, but he did spend a lot of time and money into research and development and philanthropy to try to inject money into the research to cure diabetes in her honor. He was married again in 1986. The marriage lasted less than a year. And then he had a third wife that he was married to for 4 years, that when he was married to when he retired from Chrysler in 1992, and he moved to Bel Air, California. And he mentions in his book that he was so used to Detroit, he knew where he was going, and he goes, then I moved to California because that's the place everybody's supposed to go when they retired. He says, I couldn't find my way out of a paper bag. I couldn't fit in, I didn't feel right, I wasn't getting up and going to work every day. He was a working type of guy. He wasn't happy in retirement. So that's about all I have. He did pass away at the age of, I have it here somewhere, I'm sorry, 90. I must not have taken it down. Written it down, I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I didn't write it down. I looked it up last night too. I think he was 92 when he passed away. He also contemplated a run for president in 1988. And polls suggested he would have won if he had run. But his friend, Tip O'Neill, talked him out of it. So that's about all I have. I mean, I'd love to hear any stories that you guys have about anything that I talked about or even what I didn't talk about that you could bring up. Maybe the gentleman at home has more to interject. Go ahead, sir. Yes, Scott? Uh-oh. Are you muted? Is it him or me?
Scott, you muted. Not anymore.
There we go. Thank you. I thought it was me.
So there's a story about Iaccoca that I remember quite well. And it's that when the K car was in production, Iacocca went to visit a factory where they made it. And as he walked onto the floor, the workers stopped working and applauded him. How many car executives get a standing ovation from their workforce?
Right.
They really thought he saved the company.
Well, he did. Yeah, he did, absolutely. Thank you for that. Anybody else?
John, could you touch upon, especially when he turned around Chrysler, his acceptance and quality, total quality control? Deming comes to mind, because when the Japanese car companies were, especially after World War II, they were decimated, and they adopted quality,
Right.
total quality, and the workers on the line were part of the quality, and he was one of the first ones to adopt that.
So the gentleman's question is, how he was received when he took over to versus maybe the old school curmudgeons that were there on the assembly lines and in the offices and how they received. You know, that's a really good question, and maybe the gentleman at home could answer that better than I, Scott. He asked how Lee was received at Chrysler by the old school guys that had been there for years and thought things should be business as usual.
I don't have any knowledge of that.
You don't? Okay, yeah. I would assume it didn't go well for a lot of people.
Like 42 years I was a buyer in high-tech manufacturing.
Yeah.
And we adopted total quality, which Iaccoca was one of the first ones. I remember at one time I was at Caterpillar in Illinois back in 1983. And at that time I was buying a lot of hydraulics, 83, about $6 million a year. And so I go in there, and the receptionist is wearing a blue Oxford shirt and you know, a brown khaki dress. So the vice president comes out, and a couple of the buyers come out, and they're all dressed the exact same with the, you know, khaki pants and the Oxford shirt. And I said, excuse me, is it me or is everybody here dressed the same? And he says, no, it's not you. It's the perception extended from quality that they didn't want the workers on the line to be intimidated if they had a question.
Yeah.
That was Caterpillar?
At Caterpillar, I was at Augusta, Georgia. Who's the other tractor company? I was there. They did the same thing. So
You didn't differentiate management versus the worker. They
Exactly
didn't
right.
want to have an
It was
elitist
intimidating.
attitude. So the gentleman mentioned that he was a buyer in the 1980s and he went to Caterpillar in the early 1980s to sell them hydraulics. And the management were dressed in the same khakis and blue shirt that the factory workers were basically wearing. And the reason was that we're no better than they are, so we're all in this together. And he's probably assuming that maybe Lee had the same mentality at Chrysler. And I suspect he probably did to an extent, yeah.
we got rid of incoming inspection.
Yeah.
Inspection, and then price wasn't the main thing with the suppliers. Price was the third thing. Actually, you wanted quality. Number one,
Yeah.
on-time delivery, and price is third.
Right.
And instead of dealing with 2 or 3 suppliers for one product,
Yeah.
deal with one,
One.
develop a relationship with them
Yeah.
and quality. So, like, we did that in the 80s. We got rid of income and quality. We got quality inspection. We got rid of all that. It was the onus, you know,
Yeah.
tighten the tolerances
Yeah.
and things like that.
Probably the same thing. Probably the same thing that Lee Iacocca adopted, yeah, focus.
The Japanese were doing it back
The Japanese were, yeah, the Japanese were eating our lunch, yep.
He died
Yes,
in
sir.
2019.
Died in 2019, was he 90?
24 to 91, so 2019, so 1924 to 2019.
I failed math. I had it here somewhere, of course.
I got my Irish computer once in a while.
By the way, for those of you who are not aware of it, on Sunday morning from 8 until noon, the whole car show is taking
Yes.
place, where you can see lots of the cars we talked about today.
Yeah, this is a reschedule of the car show that usually they have in the spring. They rescheduled it till the fall, and it's a beautiful setting. They closed down the drive there when Nantasket Beach is, where the old, yeah. Parking lots and the road. They closed down the road, and the cars are lined up on the road. They have to be out of their town. The town wants them done by 2 o'clock, so they could bring traffic back to normal. So I think from about 8 or 9 o'clock till about 2 in the afternoon. It's a great car show. It's supposed to be a beautiful day. It's nice to even take a walk. The beach is right there. Not too many days like this left, so take advantage. This Sunday, yeah.
Listening to you, and by the way, thank you very much for the presentation, because as you went through, you know, for, I think everybody here, you know, you're thinking about the cars that you owned. And
Yeah, I tried to interject, yeah, some personal stories.
I have because one of the more common things that would fit into that, of course, was the British car industry, which self-destructed. I have a 1965 Triumph Tr4, still in my garage. I've had it for 53 years.
Wow.
And so it's, but as you were talking about all of that, I was just thinking, yes, that's great.
I just sold through the business, I consigned it for a family, a 1959 Vauxhall Victor. And I didn't know what, and I've been into cars since I could walk. I knew a Vauxhall was British, but I didn't know what it was. I didn't know they were sold in the United States. Come to find out, the Victor was imported from, GM owned Vauxhall, which I didn't even know. They imported them to the US from 1957 to 1961 and sold them through Pontiac stores. It was a stopgap to the Volkswagen Beetle selling like crazy in the 50s, and the American car companies, GM in particular, had nothing small. Everything was big. Rambler was going crazy. Rambler's another one of my favorite cars. And the big car company, the big three, were like, oh my God, we have nothing to compete with the Beetle or the Rambler American. So a stopgap until the Corvair and the Tempest came out. They brought the Victors over from Vauxhall, and they sold them through Pontiac franchises. They sold 27,000 of them in the US. The problem was they were British. So they rusted. You know, they had electronics issues. The engines leaked oil. So to find one today I had a hard time putting a value on the car because I couldn't find prior sales. There's a lot of them in Europe still. But in the US, I found one prior sale in 10 years. I said, oh, I'm never going to find a buyer for this car, you know. I put it in Hemmings, and I found a buyer for it down in Houston. In fact, it just left yesterday for Houston on the back of a truck. So that's my British car story.
They didn't have to, they owned a European company. They didn't have to worry about emission controls.
Right.
Even if they rebadged it or didn't rebadge it, they could just bloom.
The funny thing about the Victor was that it was definitely designed for the American public. If you know the car at all, it looks like a 55 Chevy Bel Air that was shrunken. And it has the wraparound windshield that American cars had at the time, and it had a 3-speed manual transmission on the column, which Europe didn't do. We were used to it here. Everything was on the manual transmission up here, but in Europe, everything was on the floor back then. So they designed this car with a 3-speed on the column, I think, specifically to appeal to the American audience. Plus its design. Didn't quite work out too well. But I suspect, too, that the dealers didn't like the car. The Pontiac dealers probably didn't like it and didn't want to sell it because they were used to selling Bonnevilles and Star Chiefs and, you know, what's this thing? What's this piece of crap? You want me to sell this? I could just imagine. You know, it was like us at the Chrysler dealers with the Colts, the Plymouth Colts that had come over from Mitsubishi. We stocked a couple, we kept them in the back lot, the salesman never mentioned them. You know, they just didn't, it wasn't what they were used to or familiar. But the Plymouth Colt, Dodge Colt was a great little car, very reliable, Mitsubishi. So, all right, I could sit here all day, so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, appreciate it. Appreciate your time, thanks guys for tuning in.